You're driving 60,000 pounds down a mountain grade. You hit the brakes. Nothing. This was expected. States built entire ramps just so trucks had somewhere to crash safely. But the fix wasn't a better brake. It came from a guy who nearly died the same way and turned his own engine into a weapon against gravity. It worked so well, towns made it illegal. You've seen the sign, "No Jake Brake, $500 fine." Nobody outlaws something that doesn't work. Let's get into it. The problem nobody could solve. To understand why this invention mattered so much, you first need to understand just how badly American trucking needed it. Back in the early days of commercial trucking, every single truck on the road stopped the exact same way your car does. Press the pedal, brake shoes squeeze against a spinning drum, friction turns motion into heat, and the truck slows down. Simple. And on flat roads or gentle hills, it worked just fine. But take that same setup and put it on a long, steep mountain grade, and you've got a serious problem. A truck rolling downhill for miles at a time isn't braking for a second or two like you do at a stop sign. It's braking constantly, for minutes on end. And every single one of those minutes is dumping heat into the brake drums. Here's the part that should scare you. Brake drums on a hard downhill run can climb past 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And once they get that hot, the brake material starts to lose its grip. It's called brake fade, and the terrifying thing about brake fade is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't flash a warning light. It just creeps in, quietly, pedal stroke by pedal stroke, until the driver presses down as hard as they can and the truck barely slows at all. This wasn't some rare freak occurrence either. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, there were thousands of runaway truck incidents every single year in the United States. Thousands, every year. This was a known, accepted, planned-for risk of the job. States eventually built more than 150 runaway truck ramps by 1990. You've probably driven past one of these on a mountain highway and not even realized what it was for. Those steep, sand-filled or gravel-filled ramps branching off the side of the road exist for one reason only. Somewhere, at some point, so many trucks lost their brakes on that exact stretch of highway that engineers decided the only answer was to give runaway trucks a place to crash safely instead of plowing into traffic. Now, here's the twist that made the whole problem worse. Around the same time all this was happening, the trucking industry was falling in love with a new kind of engine, the diesel. Diesel engines gave truckers something gasoline engines simply couldn't match: massive torque, incredible durability, and fuel efficiency that made long-haul freight actually profitable. Naturally, once trucking companies got their hands on more powerful diesel engines, they did what any business does. They loaded more weight onto the trucks. Gross vehicle weights climbed higher and higher through the 1940s and 50s. Trailers got bigger, loads got heavier, but nobody upgraded the brakes to match. The same drum brake systems that were barely adequate for a lighter truck were now being asked to control 60 and 70,000 pound rigs coming down mountain passes. It wasn't a small gap between what the brakes could handle and what the job demanded. It was a canyon, and the industry tried everything to paper over that gap. Harder brake linings that could take more heat. Training programs that taught drivers to use short, controlled brake taps instead of holding the pedal down, just to give the drums a chance to cool between applications. Drivers learned to downshift hard before a descent, using the engine's natural drag to take some of the load off the brakes. On the worst grades, some drivers would just pull over completely and wait, sometimes 20 or 30 minutes, for their brakes to cool down enough to trust them again. None of it actually solved the problem. Every single one of those workarounds was just a way of managing brake fade, buying a little time before physics eventually won anyway. And on a long enough grade, with a heavy enough load, physics always won eventually. What the industry needed wasn't a better brake pad. It needed an entirely different way to slow a truck down. And the man who would eventually crack that problem had already come face to face with exactly what was at stake in the most terrifying way possible. Quick side note, most car problems come from small things people overlook. I put together a simple longevity guide based on everything I've learned, and it walks you through exactly what to watch for. It's linked in the description below. The Night That Changed Everything. His name was Clessie Cummins. If that last name sounds familiar, it's because he's the man behind the Cummins Engine Company, one of the most important names in American diesel history to this very day. In 1931, years before he'd even start thinking seriously about brakes, Clessie set out on a cross-country trip that was meant to prove a point. He and 2 crew members drove from New York to Los Angeles, hauling a Cummins diesel-powered race car on the back of a heavily loaded truck. The whole trip was a demonstration, a chance to show a skeptical public that diesel power could go the distance reliably. For 4 days, everything went exactly according to plan. Then, on the evening of the 5th day, they reached Cajun Pass. If you don't know it, Cajun Pass is a steep, winding descent on old U.S. Route 66, cutting through the mountains east of San Bernardino, California. Back then, this wasn't a smooth modern highway. It was narrow gravel, carved directly into the side of the mountain, with sharp switchbacks and absolutely no guardrails to catch you if something went wrong. Clessie entered the descent in too high a gear. Almost immediately, the fully loaded truck started picking up speed. He reached for the gear shift, trying to drop down into a lower gear to use the engine to slow things down. But the truck was already moving too fast to make that shift cleanly. Forcing it risked locking up the entire drivetrain, which would have been an entirely different kind of disaster. So he had no choice. He went to the brakes instead. But the drums were already hot from the upper part of the descent, and with every single application, the pedal gave him less and less. The cab filled with the smell of scorched brake lining. The truck kept accelerating on a narrow mountain road, with basically no reliable way left to slow it down. And at the bottom of that grade, a set of railroad tracks crossed the road. As Clessie came around the final curve, a freight train was moving through that exact crossing. There was no room to stop. There was nowhere to go. He was, by his own account, along for whatever was about to happen next. The caboose of that train cleared the crossing with inches to spare. Clessie got the truck stopped on the far side of the tracks, hands shaking, and by his own later account, that moment never left him for the rest of his life. He didn't just walk away from a close call. He walked away believing that the diesel engine, the very same engine that had nearly gotten him killed that night, somehow held the answer to the exact problem it had just exposed. Now here's what makes this story so interesting. He didn't chase that idea right away. Clessie spent the next couple of decades building the Cummins Engine Company into a major manufacturer, refining diesel technology, growing an empire. The brake idea sat in the back of his mind the whole time, unfinished business, waiting for the right moment. That moment came in 1955, when Clessie retired. And instead of settling into a quiet retirement, he turned his full attention back to the question that had been haunting him since that night at Cajun Pass. Could the diesel engine itself be turned into a brake? Not just something that powers a truck forward, but something that could actively fight to hold it back? The insight hiding inside every diesel engine. To understand what Clessie was working toward, you need to understand one key difference between a diesel engine and a gasoline engine, and it comes down to compression. In a gasoline engine, the piston compresses an air and fuel mixture at a ratio of roughly 9 to 12 to 1. In a diesel engine, there's no fuel in that mixture yet. It's compressing pure air, and it's doing it far more aggressively, often somewhere between 17 to 1 and over 20 to 1. That's an enormous amount of pressure being built up inside each cylinder, every single stroke. In normal operation, here's what happens with all that pressure. Near the top of the compression stroke, fuel gets injected into that superheated, super-compressed air. It ignites instantly, and that explosion drives the piston back down with tremendous force. That's the entire point of a diesel engine. All that compression energy gets returned, and then some, as raw power. Clessie's insight was this: What if you released all that compressed air before it had the chance to ignite and push the piston back down? What if, instead of getting that energy back as power, the engine simply lost it? If you could vent the compressed air out at the exact top of the stroke right before combustion, the engine would have done all the work of compressing that air without ever getting anything back for it. Now multiply that across every single cylinder, firing over and over in sequence. Instead of an engine generating power, you'd have an engine constantly absorbing energy from the drivetrain instead of feeding it. In plain English, the exact same engine that pushes a truck forward could be flipped instantly into a machine that fights to hold it back. By the mid-1950s, Clessie had worked out the core idea. Open the exhaust valve right near the top of the compression stroke, and the engine loses the energy it just built up instead of getting it back. That stored energy just escapes out through the exhaust system instead of slamming back into the crankshaft. He brought this idea to the Cummins Engine Company, the very company that bore his name. And here's the part that always gets me. Company leadership looked at it and passed. They didn't see a clear commercial path for it. The man who built the company got turned down by the company itself. So Clessie took the idea elsewhere. He struck a deal with Jacobs Manufacturing, a Connecticut company with deep experience building engine components. In April of 1960, a new division was formed specifically to turn this concept into a real, working, sellable product. Officially, the invention was called the Jacobs engine brake. But truck drivers, being truck drivers, weren't going to say all that every time. Within a very short time, everybody was just calling it the Jake brake, and that nickname has stuck for over 60 years. Building a machine that fights itself. Having the idea was one thing. Actually building it was a completely different challenge. Jacobs engineers needed a mechanism that could pop open an exhaust valve at exactly the right split-second moment on an engine that was already spinning at highway speed, using parts that could be bolted onto existing production engines without a total redesign. Their solution was genuinely clever. They used the engine's own oil pressure to do the work. Here's how it functioned. A housing sat above the rocker arms, containing a pair of pistons, a master piston, and a slave piston. When the driver flipped a switch inside the cab to activate the system, a solenoid valve opened up and let pressurized engine oil flood into that housing. As the injector rocker arm rose along its cam lobe during normal engine rotation, it pushed down on the master piston, trapping that oil and building hydraulic pressure inside the housing. That pressure transferred over to the slave piston, which then briefly popped open the exhaust valve right at the top of the compression stroke, at the exact moment before the compressed air could shove the piston back down. The compressed charge just escaped straight out through the exhaust. All that stored compression energy dissipated instead of driving the engine forward. And the piston came back down with nothing left to push against it. In that split second, the engine had been converted in real time from a machine that makes power into a machine that eats power. That's the entire trick. That's the whole invention. The first production units shipped for Cummins NH series engines back in 1961. It didn't take long for the rest of the industry to notice. Detroit Diesel adapted the system for their 71 series engines. Caterpillar followed. Mack followed. One by one, the biggest names in American diesel power realized this wasn't a gimmick. It was a genuine answer to a problem the entire industry had been fighting for decades. And on a fully loaded Class 8 truck heading down a long mountain grade, a properly working Jake brake could hold the truck at a steady, controlled speed, sometimes without the driver ever touching the service brake pedal at all. Later versions let drivers select how many cylinders were engaged, dialing in exactly how much braking force matched the grade they were on. And here's the best part. It never faded. It generated no heat in the service brakes whatsoever because it wasn't a friction brake at all. It could run for as long as the descent required, with zero degradation. Think about what that actually meant for a driver who ran mountain routes for a living. Before this invention, going down a steep grade in a loaded truck was a constant exercise in fear. Constant calculating how much brake pressure to apply, how long to hold it, when to let off so the drums could cool, whether the grade up ahead was about to get steeper. It was mentally exhausting, on top of being genuinely dangerous. After the Jake brake, drivers described something completely different. They could engage the system right at the top of a grade, dial in the braking level that matched the road, and ride the entire descent with their foot completely off the brake pedal, feeling the engine hold that truck steady the whole way down. No fade, no fear, just controlled, predictable resistance for as long as the mountain lasted. And it wasn't just about confidence either. Brake lining wear dropped dramatically on trucks running the Jake brake, which meant lower maintenance costs and fewer breakdowns on the side of the road. For fleet operators sending trucks through the Rockies, the Appalachians, or the Sierra Nevada week after week, this wasn't a nice-to-have anymore. This was a game changer that paid for itself. But there was one thing nobody at Jacobs Manufacturing had fully planned for. And it's the exact reason this invention eventually got branded, quite literally, illegal in towns across the country. The sound that got it banned. Here's the trade-off nobody saw coming. When a Jake brake fires, it's rapidly popping open exhaust valves across multiple cylinders, releasing that trapped compressed air directly out through the exhaust system, over and over, hundreds of times a minute at highway speed. And that produces a very specific, very aggressive sound, a sharp, rattling machine gun clatter that carries for a long, long way. On trucks without mufflers, or running straight exhaust stacks, which a lot of owner-operators loved for the extra power they delivered, that sound got amplified even further. Out on an open highway, surrounded by nothing but fields and hills, it was just part of the background noise of trucking. Nobody thought twice about it. But in a small town at 2 in the morning, with a fully loaded truck coming down a grade right through a residential neighborhood, that sound became something else entirely. It became a genuine, recurring nuisance for people trying to sleep. As the Jake brake spread across the industry through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, complaints started piling up. And towns responded the way towns respond. They put up signs. You've almost certainly seen them if you've driven through mountain country. No engine brake. No Jake brake, sometimes with a specific dollar fine listed right underneath. Here's the thing, though. This argument was genuinely more complicated than it looked. Residents had a fair point. The noise really was disruptive, and in a lot of cases, drivers absolutely could have used their service brakes through town and saved the engine brake for the open highway outside city limits. But drivers and safety advocates pushed back just as hard, and their argument was just as fair. Restricting the Jake brake specifically in areas where steep grades existed was asking drivers to lean on the exact same friction brakes that were most likely to fail in exactly those conditions. That's the whole reason the invention existed in the first place. A lot of drivers simply ignored the signs on the steepest grades, calculating that the risk of a brake fade event on a loaded truck far outweighed the risk of a fine that might not even get issued. And those fines, where they were actually enforced, could run several $100s in some places. Enforcement was wildly inconsistent from town to town, and the legal standing of a lot of these local ordinances was genuinely shaky. That debate never really got fully resolved. Those signs are still out there today, on plenty of routes where trucking corridors and residential neighborhoods happen to share the same stretch of road. Now, before we get into how all of this got resolved, and it did get resolved in a pretty remarkable way, this is exactly the kind of story that deserves more than just a quick watch. If you're the kind of person who actually cares about the engineering behind American machines and not just the shiny paint job, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me if you've ever actually heard a Jake brake echo through a mountain town, Subscribe to the channel and tap that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories. All right, back to it. And that right there is the real story behind one of the most recognizable sounds on the American highway. A sound that some towns tried to ban, that some drivers refused to give up even when it cost them a fine, all because one man survived a night he was never supposed to survive and decided that wasn't going to be the end of the story. If you learned something new today, or if you've got a story about hearing that unmistakable Jake brake clatter roll through your own hometown, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and honestly, some of the best video ideas on this channel have come straight from you guys. If this is your first time here, welcome to America on Wheels. We dig into the machines, the history, and the stories behind American vehicles that most people drive right past without ever knowing the truth behind them. If that sounds like your kind of channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so YouTube actually lets you know when the next one drops. And if you want to keep learning about the machines that quietly built this country, check out the next video right on your screen. I think you're going to love it just as much as this one. Thanks for riding along. We'll see you in the next one.